in a certain sense, everything that I've given you from Kant so far has been leading up to this passage. And it's in this passage that he articulates the second version of the categorical imperative. Remember that he's looking for something that is intrinsically valuable, something which is an objective end and not a subjective end. And we'll go over some of the basics of that in subjective end, objective end, categorical imperative, first version, second version, intrinsic worth, extrinsic worth. Is that a word? I don't know. But he's looking for something which is valuable in itself, not valuable because anyone happens to value it, but something that we would all recognize as having value no matter what our feelings were. And he's identified it. It's a human being, but it's not quite so simple. He says, now I say man, and again, that means human being, obviously, and generally any rational being. Okay, we were already sort of introduced to that strange idea of a non-human rational being that none of us has never encountered, but we can all imagine. So man and generally any rational being exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but in all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. It's a very important and powerful idea. A human being and any rational creature, we all recognize as being something that we cannot exploit, something we could never use merely as a means, that we always must regard as an end. Never as a means to an end, always as an end in itself. Kant continues, all objects of the inclinations have only a conditional worth. For if the inclinations and the wants founded on them did not exist, then their object would be without value. That's just another explanation of what it means for something to have subjective value. He goes into a few things in the next few sentences that for the moment I'd like to ignore, but we'll come back to. And I'd just like to skip ahead to he basically says animals do not qualify because they're irrational beings. He says on page 3, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value is means, and therefore are called things. Now that's very, very complex, and in our day, I think we have a much more nuanced approach to animals, but Kant is basically saying that anything that doesn't have rationality, anything that is not a person, is a thing. And then he continues, and this is the really important part, rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves. So you could say that for Kant, everything in the universe falls into one of two categories, thing and person. Clearly, inanimate objects are things. We're going to ignore for the moment the status of animals. Because that is, a whole subject unto itself. But in inanimate objects, rocks and stones, tables and chairs, these non-living, they're inanimate objects. They're things, and then there are persons like you and me. We are persons, and the second categorical imperative, as we see, is a rule about how important it is to recognize the difference. Some things have only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far, therefore, restricts our freedom of action. and is an object of respect. And that restricts our freedom of action. Pay close attention to that. Because he's talking about there's two entirely different sets of rules for how we deal with things on the one hand and how we deal with people or persons on the other. Basically, when it comes to a thing, there are no rules. You can do whatever you want to a thing. Your freedom of action is not limited with regard to a thing. But your freedom of action is definitely restricted, limited, with regard to how you deal with a person. You must recognize that with regard to the person, you must treat them with respect, as he says, an object of respect. I mean, if I'm tired and I want to sit down, I can sit on the chair without asking his permission. But if I'm tired and I want to sit down, I can't sit on a person. Right? I mean, it's just as an example. If I'm angry and I want to let loose some of my anger, and I slam my fist on the table, that's okay. But if I'm angry and I want to get out some of my anger, I can't slam my fist on a person. You know, that is, it's just all of us recognize that. It's built in. We all recognize that we have duties to persons. We all recognize that persons must be treated with respect. And that's the intuitive thing that Kant is relying on here. He continues here, right here, and he says, these, therefore, are not merely subjective ends whose existence has a worth for us as an effect of our action, but objective ends. That is, things whose existence is an end in itself. He's talking about persons. An end, moreover, for which no other can be substituted, which they should subserve merely as means. You can never use a person as a means for something more important than a person, because there's nothing more important than a person. For otherwise, nothing whatever would possess absolute worth. But if all worth were conditioned and therefore contingent, then there would be no supreme practical principle of reason whatsoever. The whole of Kant's philosophy, all the stuff about duty and categorical imperatives, it all depends on something in the world having intrinsic absolute value, and that something is a person. So he says, if then there is a supreme practical principle, or in respect of the human will, a categorical imperative, it must be one which, being drawn from the conception of that which is necessarily an end for everyone, because it is an end in itself, constitutes an objective principle of will, and can therefore serve as a universal practical law. The foundation of this principle is rational nature, that is, a rational creature, a being, a living being which is rational, exists as an end in itself. The whole thing depends on that. Man, human beings, necessarily conceive their own existence as being so. That is, we all recognize ourselves as having unique, particular, individual, intrinsic worth. So far, then, this is a subjective principle of human actions. But every other rational being regards its existence similarly, just as on the same rational principle that holds for me. That is, I recognize that I value myself just because I'm a person. I also recognize that everyone else values themselves for the same reason. Therefore, I am led by consistency to value all rational creatures as having intrinsic worth. But every other rational rational being regards its existence similarly, just on the same rational principle that holds for me, so that it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical law, all laws of the will must be capable of being deduced. It all boils down to this. Accordingly, the practical imperative, that is, this is the second version of the categorical imperative, which is so important and so influential. It will be as follows: so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end, never as means only. So act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end, never as means only. Perhaps it's the most important moral principle ever articulated. And I'm not exaggerating. It's the basis for the idea of human rights. It's the basis for the idea of a sane, liberal, egalitarian, humane society, that every human being must be treated with respect. They must always be treated as an end, never as a means to an end. And everybody has dignity and everyone should be valued. It's really, as I speak it, it in another form, it is the centerpiece of Catholic moral teaching. There's no denying it. But that's different insofar as that rests upon our notion of human beings having a special relationship with God. With Kant, he thinks it's just built into pure reason, that there's no theological, religious element to it. But the similarity is unmistakable. And in whatever form we take it, it's absolutely essential, not just in how we live our individual lives, where we respect other human beings or any rational creatures and realize that we have duties to them, but it's built into our notion of what kind of society we want, what kind of world we want. And it guides us insofar as we want to change the world. Everything may boil down to that in every respect in which we want to change the world, it's so that human beings are treated with more respect.